My name is Dr. Elias Thorne. I hold a doctorate in forest ecology from Colorado State University, with a postdoctoral focus on disturbance-driven ecosystems, particularly pyrophytic succession in the Southern Rockies ecoregion. This document is not a plea for help, nor is it a confession whispered from a padded cell. It is a report. It is the final, and only, truthful account of the events that transpired during my assignment in the Uncompahgre Pike Consolidated District from October to November of 2024. I have been deemed psychologically unfit for duty. My meticulously recorded findings dismissed as trauma-induced fantasy, the product of isolation and a mind unmoored. But the data does not lie. The measurements, the photographs, the coordinates, they are immutable. I am presenting my findings here, exactly as I recorded them in my field journal, before they are systematically buried under the weight of official denial and redacted into oblivion. My mission, on paper, was straightforward and, to me, deeply fulfilling: to conduct a multi-year ecological survey within a designated burned scar, a vast wound in the landscape left by the Hayman fire years prior. The U.S. Forest Service required a comprehensive analysis of vegetation regrowth and faunal repopulation across several critical elevation zones. My study area was a remote, rugged section of the Pike National Forest, a place of dramatic verticality, where the land climbs from the rolling foothills at 7,000 feet to the stark, wind-scarred peaks approaching 12,000 feet. It is a world stratified by altitude, a living laboratory of ecological succession. The lower elevations are characterized by open ponderosa pine, savannas, their long taproots anchoring them in the dry, windswept soil, their barks smelling faintly of vanilla in the warm afternoon sun. They are resilient, fire-adapted giants. Higher up, these give way to dense, almost claustrophobic stands of lodgepole pine, a forest born of fire, their serotinous cones waiting patiently for the heat that will release their seeds and begin the cycle anew. Above 9,000 feet, you enter the subalpine zone, a dark, primeval world of Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir, where the air grows thin and cold, and the forest floor is a deep, damp carpet of fallen needles. Here, snowpack can persist in shaded hollows well into the summer, and the silence is so profound it feels like a physical presence. It is a landscape of profound beauty and unforgiving harshness, a mosaic of life zones, dictated by elevation, aspect, and the brutal whims of climate. My job was to quantify this recovery, to translate the forest's slow, silent, and tenacious rebirth into charts, figures, and peer-reviewed papers. I was a man of science, of empirical observation. I believed that everything, given enough study, could be measured, categorized, and ultimately explained. The first 2 weeks were a balm to my soul, a routine of demanding physical labor and mental peace. I established my base camp in a small, isolated Forest Service cabin, a sturdy but lonely structure of peeled logs and a green metal roof, and began the arduous task of laying out my transect lines. The work was a familiar meditation, driving steel posts into the rocky soil, stretching a surveyor's tape between them, and meticulously documenting every plant, every track, every sign of life within the prescribed area. The silence of the high country was absolute, broken only by the sighing of the wind in the pines and the distant, territorial call of a Steller's jay. The initial anomalies were subtle, easily dismissed as quirks of the wilderness. On the 3rd of October, I hiked to Transect 7, a line of marked steel posts, running through a recovering stand of quaking aspen. The 7th marker post, a 40-pound piece of steel I had pounded 2 feet into the ground myself, had been moved. It was not bent or knocked over, as if by a curious bear or a winter blowdown. It had been pulled cleanly from the earth and placed, with impossible care, 15 meters to the west. Around its base, a collection of milky quartz stones, gathered from a nearby creek bed, had been arranged in a neat, deliberate spiral. I cursed the thought of local vandals, logged it as such, and spent an irritated hour resetting the post, my scientific serenity momentarily disturbed. The first carcass appeared a week later, and with it, the first true tremor of cognitive dissonance. It was a mature bull elk, discovered in a high meadow of late blooming wild flowers near the edge of the subalpine zone. From a distance, it looked as if it were merely sleeping in the sun. As I drew closer, the wrongness of the scene became a physical pressure against my skin, a cold knot in my stomach. There were no signs of a struggle, no torn earth, no broken branches, no tracks, not from a mountain lion, not from a bear, not even the scuffed hoof prints of the elk itself. Most unnervingly, there was no blood. The ground beneath the animal, a carpet of Indian paintbrush and lupine, was pristine. The wound itself was a masterpiece of grotesque precision. The soft tissue from the jaw to the upper neck, including the tongue and larynx, had been excised, removed. The cut was a clean, almost cauterized line, exposing the white bone of the mandible. It looked less like the work of a predator and more like a surgical procedure, performed with an instrument of impossible sharpness and heat. It was reminiscent of the lurid tales I'd heard from the San Luis Valley, stories of mutilated cattle and a horse named Snippy, which I had always dismissed as rural folklore. Over the next 10 days, I found 2 more, a doe and a yearling, in different locations but in the exact same state of bloodless, surgical mutilation. The sights shared an eerie, uniform quality, an unnatural, sterile silence. No birds sang in the surrounding trees. No squirrels chattered from the branches. The ubiquitous forest scavengers, coyotes, vultures, even the carrion beetles and flies, were conspicuously absent. It was as if a sterile bubble had been placed over these locations, preserving them in a state of perfect, morbid stillness. My scientific mind reeled, desperately searching for a rational cause. A new, highly localized pathogen that caused rapid, bloodless decay. A typical predation by an unknown animal with an unheard of method of killing. Ritualistic activity by a local cult, perhaps one of the fringe groups, rumored to habit the woods around Manitou Springs, a place with its own strange legends of witches and animal remains. Every hypothesis crumbled against the sheer, defiant impossibility of the evidence. To process the growing cognitive dissonance, to try and force the phenomena, back into the neat boxes of my worldview, I began a formal anomaly log in my field journal. It was a desperate attempt to impose order on the encroaching chaos, but the entries only chronicled my descent into the inexplicable. The first entry, on October 3rd, noted the moved transect marker, T7, now surrounded by a precise spiral of rocks. I'd labeled it as potential vandalism, but the anomalous factors were glaring. No tracks, human or animal, and the 40-pound post had been pulled cleanly from the earth. Then came the carcasses. On October 9th, I logged the first bull elk, hypothesizing an atypical poacher or an unknown predator, yet the evidence defied this. There was no blood spatter, no entry wound, no tracks of any kind, and a complete, unnatural absence of scavengers. By October 12th, I had found 2 more identically mutilated elk, a doe and a yearling. I speculated about a fast, acting pathogen or even ritualistic activity by a cult. But the sheer precision of the cuts and the continued lack of any human evidence rendered these ideas useless. The log did not help. It only served to starkly illustrate the failure of my framework. The impossibility escalated on October 15th, when all 10 markers on Transect 7 were rearranged overnight into a large, complex geometric pattern resembling a starburst. A coordinated team would have been required, working for hours in the dark. Yet they left no tire tracks on the access road. Not a single footprint. The final entry before I stopped writing was from October 17th. One of my subterranean soil probes, buried 30 centimeters deep, recorded an instantaneous temperature spike to 150 degrees Celsius at 20:14 a.m. The event lasted 3.2 seconds. It was a localized, inexplicable burst of intense energy, as there had been no storm, and no other probes were affected. This catalog of impossibilities mocked my attempts at rational explanation. The world I knew, a world governed by predictable, physical laws and biological imperatives, was beginning to fray at the edges, unraveling like a poorly woven tapestry. I felt a new kind of cold settle deep into my bones, one that had nothing to do with the falling autumn temperatures and the shortening days. It was the cold, primal dread of realizing you are not merely observer of a system, but a tiny, insignificant component within a system that is actively, intelligently, and silently observing you back. The profound silence of the ponderosa pines was no longer peaceful. It was watchful. The phenomena escalated, shifting their focus. They moved from the tangible, static evidence of carcasses and moved markers to a direct and sustained assault on my senses. A psychological siege designed to dismantle my sanity piece by piece. The attacks began at night, alone in my cabin, miles from any other human soul, surrounded by an ocean of black forest. I started to hear things. At first, it was a faint, discordant melody that seemed to drift on the wind, like the sound of a distant orchestra, tuning up in a vast, empty concert hall. I would stand at the cabin's single pane window, peering into the impenetrable blackness of the spruce forest, my breath fogging the cold glass, trying to locate a source. A radio. Late-night campers with peculiar taste in music. But the sound was too clean, too ethereal, and it seemed to come from all directions at once. a non-localized acoustic anomaly that defied the physics of sound propagation. It was the exact type of auditory hallucination reported by the Lee family in the infamous Black Forest haunting, a case I'd read about with detached, academic curiosity. Then came the metallic sounds. A heavy, rhythmic rattling, like someone dragging immense, rusted chains across the granite bedrock of the mountainside. It was a sound from another age, a sound of dungeons and medieval ghosts, utterly alien to this wilderness of pine and stone. I would lie in my bunk, rigid, my muscles clenched, listening to it echo canyons for minutes at a time, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. But the worst sound, the one that scraped at the deepest, most primal parts of my brain, was the scream. It would erupt from the darkness without warning, a sound that tore at the very fabric of the night. It was not the cry of any known animal in North America. It was a horrifying hybrid, a fusion of a woman's terrified, piercing shriek and the guttural, predatory roar of a large carnivore. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated terror and incandescent rage, and it echoed for what felt like an eternity before being abruptly swallowed by the oppressive silence that followed. During the day, the auditory assault was replaced by a crushing, psychic weight, a constant, prickling sensation of being watched. I'd be kneeling to check a soil moisture sensor or documenting the regrowth of fireweed, and the feeling would descend upon me like a shroud. A cold, absolute certainty that unseen eyes were following my every move from the dense, shadowy cover of the trees. I started finding things on the rough hewn porch of my cabin, small, strange offerings left during the night. A perfectly spherical river stone, polished to a glassy smoothness, beyond what any natural tumbling could achieve. A single, iridescent raven feather placed dead center on my doormat. A small, intricately carved piece of wood that looked vaguely like a stylized human figure, its proportions unsettlingly long and thin. They were not overtly threatening, but they were deeply, profoundly unsettling. Messages from an unknown and unknowable intelligence. After a week of this relentless psychological warfare, I was fraying, sleep-deprived and perpetually on edge. My scientific objectivity shattered. I drove my forest service truck down the winding, corrugated dirt road to the nearest town, a small, historic place called Alma, clinging precariously to the side of the mountains. I needed supplies, but more than that, I needed the reassuring presence of other people, the mundane noise of civilization, to convince myself I wasn't losing my mind. Seeking some context, anything to anchor my experiences in a shared reality, I visited the town's small, dusty mining museum and historical society. The archives were a cramped back room, smelling of decaying paper and time. A collection of settler diaries, mining company ledgers, and brittle local newspapers dating back to the 1880s. What I found there did not comfort me. It terrified me because it validated my experiences. I found stories of my forest, stories that mirrored my own with chilling, uncanny accuracy. An 1890s article from a defunct newspaper, the Park County Prospector, spoke of a creature the lumberjacks called the slide, rock, bolter, a ravenous monster of local folklore, said to inhabit the steepest slopes, blamed for the mysterious disappearance of tools, supplies, and occasionally livestock. Miners' journals from the turn of the century were filled with hushed, fearful accounts of tummy knockers, mischievous or malevolent spirits they blamed for strange knocking sounds deep within the earth. Sounds that sometimes warned of cave-ins, or sometimes seemed to lure men towards collapsed tunnels and their doom. Then I found the file. It was a thin, manila folder, tucked away in a box of miscellaneous county records, simply labeled Unexplained Disappearances, Pike District. Inside were brittle, yellowed reports typed on manual typewriters. A family of 4 vanished from their locked cabin in the winter of 1888, leaving a full, steaming dinner on the table. A prospector named Silas Kane, who went looking for a hidden gold mine in the Flatirons and was never seen again. His mule found wandering weeks later, its saddlebags empty. And then, the one that made my blood run cold a 4-year-old boy named Alfred Bale Hartz, who disappeared from a family picnic near Fall River in 1938. The search was one of the largest in the state's history. The detail that seized my attention was a witness report from 2 hikers who, days later, claimed to have seen a small boy high on an inaccessible, sheer rock ledge they called the Devil's Nest. The reports noted a disturbing pattern, one that researcher David Paulides would later codify and name Missing 411 OS. The victims often vanished near boulder fields or creeks, in areas of significant Native American importance, places the Ute tribes considered sacred or taboo. My cabin, my base of operations, was less than 2 miles from a large, glacial boulder field situated right next to Tarryall Creek. In a box of miscellaneous historical pamphlets, I found one published by a local Ute cultural group. It was poorly translated, but its message was stark and clear. It spoke of the mountains not as inert rock, but as sacred, living beings. It warned against disturbing certain valleys and canyons, which it called places of emergence, where the veil between the spirit world and the physical world was thin. It spoke of a tragedy at Grand Lake, where the spirits of drowned Ute women and children were said to wail beneath the winter ice, a place the Utes considered bad medicine and avoided for generations. My study area, I realized with a jolt of ice, water dread, was not just a recovering ecosystem. It was considered sacred, forbidden ground. I drove back to my cabin as dusk was falling, my mind a chaotic whirlwind of folklore, history, and encroaching fear. I pulled over at a scenic overlook to watch the last rays of sun paint the jagged peaks in hues of incandescent orange and deep purple. The landscape was achingly beautiful, but it no longer felt benign or neutral. It felt ancient, aware, and predatory. And that's when I saw it. On a high, distant ridge, silhouetted against the fading, bruised twilight, a figure stood. It was tall, impossibly so, and stick-thin, its limbs elongated and angular. It was not a man, not a bear, not a deer. It moved with a swift, disjointed, unnatural gait, like a broken marionette or a glitching frame in a film. It took too long, loping, strides that covered an impossible distance, and then it simply vanished over the crest of the ridge. The sighting lasted no more than 5 seconds, but it was absolute, burned onto my retinas. My scientific skepticism, my carefully constructed worldview, shattered into a million irreparable pieces. I was no longer dealing with vandals or strange weather patterns or my own fracturing psyche. I was dealing with a thing, and it knew I was here. The sighting of the figure on the ridge changed everything. The detached curiosity of the scientist was burned away by a white, hot flash of primal fear. It was replaced by the gnawing, visceral terror of prey that has finally seen its predator. But fear is a powerful catalyst. It can paralyze, or it can propel. For me, it clarified. The scattered, terrifying phenomena were no longer random. They were pieces of a puzzle, and I now held the central, connecting piece. My rational mind, though battered and bruised, latched onto the one tangible clue. From my frantic research in the Alma archives, Devil's Nest, the name of the inaccessible ledge where the lost boy, Alfred Bale Hartz, was supposedly seen in 1938. I spread my topographical maps across the cabin's small table, my hands shaking slightly. There it was, a deep, isolated, and unnamed canyon in the most remote sector of my study area. But scrawled in faint pencil on this old Forest Service map was the same name, Devil's Nest. It was the epicenter. I knew, with a chilling certainty that defied logic and reason, that all the phenomena, the surgically precise carcasses, the impossible sounds, the watchful silence, the stick, thin figure, emanated from that place. I had to go there. I packed a light but essential kit, extra water, high energy rations, my GPS unit, a reliable magnetic compass, a headlamp, and my geology hammer, its weight a small comfort in my hand. I set out at dawn, the air crisp and cold, under a sky the color of steel. The hike into the canyon was a descent into another world, a journey backward in time. As I dropped in elevation, the familiar ponderosa and lodgepole pines of the montane zone gave way to an ancient, towering forest of Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir. Their branches, heavy with thick, green moss, intertwined overhead, blocking out the sun and creating a perpetual, gloomy twilight on the forest floor. The temperature plummeted, a sudden, unnatural cold that had nothing to do with the altitude or the shade. My breath plumed in front of my face in thick, white clouds. Then, my equipment, my tethers to the modern, rational world, began to fail. The screen on my GPS flickered erratically, displaying a scramble of nonsensical characters before going completely dead. I pulled out my compass. The needle, instead of pointing resolutely north, spun uselessly, rotating in slow, lazy circles as if searching for a pole that no longer existed. I was navigating by instinct alone, drawn deeper into the canyon by a force I couldn't explain. The trees themselves seemed warped and diseased, their trunks twisted into agonized, spiraling shapes, as if they had grown in a place where the laws of physics were bent. It was then that I began to see the lights. At first, they were faint, ephemeral pulses in my peripheral vision, easily dismissed as phosphenes from exhaustion. But as I went deeper, they became bold and distinct, shimmering, silent orbs of cobalt blue, emerald green, and bled, red light that danced and weaved between the ancient trees. They moved with a silent, intelligent purpose, weaving intricate, geometric patterns in the gloom, sometimes hovering motionless before darting away into the shadows. I remembered reading the account of the Lee family, who experienced a terrifying haunting in the Black Forest. They described flashing lights like the 4th of July in their living room, phenomena a Hopi shaman had attributed to something he called a rainbow vortex, a gateway, a place where the membrane between the world of the living and the world of the dead was thin and permeable. I was walking through that vortex now. The air itself felt thick and heavy, charged with static electricity that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. A low, subsonic hum vibrated up through the soles of my boots, a sound I felt in my bones and teeth more than I heard with my ears. After what felt like hours of navigating this disorienting, luminous landscape, I reached the canyon floor. The sight that greeted me stopped me dead in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. In the center of the valley was a perfect circle of barren, scorched earth, roughly 50 meters in diameter. Not a single blade of grass, not a single weed, not even a patch of moss grew within its sharply defined boundary. The air inside the circle shimmered with a visible, heatless energy, and the low hum was now a palpable, physical force that made my vision vibrate at the edges. And in the absolute center of the circle stood the source. It was a monolith, a 10-foot tall, perfectly smooth, metallic rectangle, its surface a polished, non-reflective black that seemed to drink the dim light around it, creating a void in space. It was utterly featureless, seamless, and cold to the touch. It was identical in description to the mysterious object that had recently appeared and disappeared on a hill near Fort Collins, an object that had baffled the media and authorities before it was quietly removed. But this was no modern art installation or college prank. This felt ancient, eternal. It was a machine. It was a terminal. It was a doorway. I knew, with a sudden, terrifying clarity that bypassed all my years of scientific training and logical deduction, what this place was. This was the Sipapu, the place of emergence from the old Ute and Navajo legends I had read about, the place where they believed their ancestors were led underground by, and people, to escape a great cataclysm, the place where the star people were said to enter our reality aboard flying seed pods. It wasn't a myth. It was a physical location, a functioning terminal between worlds, and it was active. As the sun began to set, its last rays unable to penetrate the deep canyon, casting long, distorted shadows across the valley, the monolith began to thrum with greater intensity. The hum rose in pitch, becoming a low, resonant tone. And then they emerged. They did not come from the monolith itself, but materialized from the deepest shadows at the edge of the clearing, drawn to the structure's energy like nocturnal insects to a bug zapper. My mind, my poor, scientifically trained human mind, struggled to categorize the impossible parade of creatures that shambled, skittered, and strode into the open. There was a hulking, bipedal form covered in shaggy, dark hair, its massive shoulders slumped as it moved, with a surprisingly fluid, silent grace. Its sheer size and ape-like shape were unmistakable. A Sasquatch, a creature of campfire stories and grainy photographs, real and solid and smelling of damp earth and musk. Behind it, two gaunt, pale figures moved with the same disjointed stop-motion speed as the thing I had seen on the ridge. Their limbs were too long. Their joints seemed to bend at impossible, backward angles. Skinwalkers, the shapeshifters of nightmare legend. Their eyes black and devoid of any light or soul. From the gnarled roots of the ancient spruce trees, a group of small, twisted humanoids scurried forth, their eyes glowing with a faint, malevolent phosphorescence. They were bent, monstrous caricatures of the wee tricksters, the old Cornish miners called tomahawkers, their faces wizened and cruel. And there were others, things made of shadow and flickering light, things that defied geometry, things for which our language had no words. They were not a pack or a herd. They were a collection, a horrifying menagerie of Colorado's darkest legends and cryptids, all gathered in one impossible place. They ignored me completely, their attention fixed on the humming monolith, as if waiting for a signal, waiting for the door to fully open. In that moment of pure, undiluted terror, I understood. The legends weren't separate stories. They were all true, all facets of a single, horrifying, intersecting reality. This valley wasn't haunted. It was a habitat, and I was trespassing. I was crouched behind a large, moss-covered boulder at the edge of the clearing, my body frozen in a state of absolute terror, my mind screaming. The creatures continued their silent, patient vigil around the humming black monolith, a congregation of impossibilities under the deepening twilight. The air grew colder, the resonant tone from the black slab deepening in pitch, vibrating in my chest cavity. I don't know how long I watched them, paralyzed by a fear so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing me into the earth. An hour, a lifetime, then a single, fatal mistake. Shifting my weight to relieve a cramping muscle, my boot dislodged a small, loose stone. It skittered across the face of the boulder and landed on the barren, scorched earth of the clearing with a soft click. The sound was insignificant, a tiny punctuation mark in the vast wilderness. Yet in the charged, humming silence of that valley, it was as loud as a gunshot. Every head turned, every pair of glowing black, or multi-faced eyes, snapped towards my hiding place in perfect, horrifying unison. The collective weight of their attention was a physical blow, a wave of malevolence that struck me with the force of a hurricane. The hunt began. I scrambled backwards, walking away from the boulder, then turned and ran, my lungs screaming for air that felt too thin to sustain life. The forest that had been merely unsettling on the way down was now actively, malevolently hostile. The faint path I had followed was gone, vanished as if it had never existed. Trees seemed to shift and wreathe in my peripheral vision, their low, hanging branches grabbing at my clothes like skeletal hands. The ground itself became treacherous, roots snaking out from the earth to trip me, rocks turning under my feet. I felt a profound sense of temporal distortion, a waking nightmare. I ran for what felt like hours, my legs burning, my lungs on fire. Yet the sliver of moon remained fixed in the sky, refusing to move. It was the legend of Boulder's enchanted mesa, made terrifyingly real. A place where time itself became a fluid, predatory trap. Behind me, I could hear them coming. The heavy, thudding footfalls of the Sasquatch crashing through the undergrowth. The dry, skittering sounds of the smaller, gnarled creatures. And worst of all, that horrifying, part human, part animal screech echoing through the twisted trees. A sound of pure, murderous rage. I was not going to outrun them. I was not going to outfight them. My only hope, my only chance at survival, was to outthink them. My panicked mind, in a moment of desperate clarity, latched onto my training, my knowledge of the land. I remembered the geology of the region's steep, unstable scree slopes, a consequence of the rapid tectonic uplift of the Rockies. The canyon I had descended was a natural bottleneck, its walls sheer and fractured. An idea, born of pure desperation, formed in my mind. I veered off my frantic, pathless flight, scrambling directly up a steep, loose rock face, pulling myself upward with bleeding hands. The creatures followed, their unnatural agility allowing them to scale the treacherous incline with terrifying ease. I could hear them closing the distance. I reached a point just below the canyon rim, a section of heavily fractured granite and loose shale I had noted on my way down as being dangerously unstable. I pulled my geology hammer from my belt. With the last of my adrenaline-fueled strength, I began striking at the key stress points in the rock face. The sound of steel on stone ringing out like a frantic alarm bell in the night. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deep, grinding groan that seemed to come from the heart of the mountain itself, the rock face began to move. A cascade of small rocks turned into an avalanche of massive boulders, a roaring, grinding river of stone and earth that poured down into the narrow canyon entrance below. I heard a final, collective screech of fury and frustration from the darkness before it was abruptly cut off by the deafening thunder of the landslide. I had buried the valley. I had sealed the door. I stumbled through the wilderness for 2 more days, delirious from exhaustion, dehydration, and profound shock. A pair of hikers found me on a roadside, miles from my truck, my clothes torn, my face and hands bloody, rambling incoherently about monoliths and monsters in a place called Devil's Nest. My official debriefing with my superiors at the Forest Service was a quiet, humiliating disaster. I presented my logbook, my frantic sketches of the creatures, my soil temperature data, my disjointed but earnest report. They listened with polite, pitying expressions, exchanging glances that spoke volumes. The official conclusion, typed up and placed in my permanent file, was trauma-induced psychosis, brought on by prolonged isolation and high-altitude stress. I was placed on indefinite medical leave. My career, my life's work, over in an instant. The day before I was scheduled to be driven off the mountain, 2 men visited my cabin. They were not from the Forest Service. They wore plain, dark, ill-fitting suits that looked utterly out of place in the rustic setting. They didn't ask about my mental state or offer condolences. They asked very specific, very calm, and very unnerving questions. Daguerre. Thorn, the first one said, his eyes cold and analytical, described the sound the monolith made. Was it a steady hum? Or did it pulse at a measurable frequency? The second one asked, his voice devoid of emotion, the lights you saw in the canyon, did they react to your presence, or did they follow a predetermined path? They listened intently to my answers, nodding slowly, making no notes. They suggested, in a placid, reasonable tone that was more terrifying than any scream, that what I had experienced might have been the result of or conventional atmospheric testing from one of the nearby military installations, or perhaps a mass hallucination induced by localized infrasound phenomena from geological instability. Their calm, knowing denial was more chilling than the screech of any creature. They were not there to debunk my story. They were there to contain it. They confiscated my journal, my samples, and every photograph I had taken, citing national security. I am writing this now, years later, from a small, rented house in a flat, featureless landscape, as far from the mountains and their watchful silence as I can get. I no longer look at a forest and see an ecosystem of trees and animals. I see a veil. My final conclusion, the one I could not put in my official report, the one that keeps me awake at night, is this: all of it is true. The Ute legends of the Sipapu and the Star People, in their flying seed pods, the settlers' tales of the Slide, Rock Bolter, and the Tommy Knockers, the modern accounts of Bigfoot sightings, of surgically mutilated cattle, of the strange, dancing lights o' the San Luis Valley, of the ghosts on Riverdale Road, and the witches of Manitou. They are not separate myths. They are different people from different centuries, with different languages and belief systems, all trying to describe the same fundamental, impossible, and terrifying truth. There are places in this world, deep in the ancient forests of Colorado, where our reality wears thin. These are not places that are haunted by the spirits of the dead. They are places that are inhabited by another kind of life, a complete and parallel ecosystem that operates by a different set of physical and biological laws, one that sometimes bleeds through into our own. I did not discover a monster. I stumbled into a habitat. I escaped, and I sealed one of its entrances. But I know the monolith is still there, humming in the eternal dark, beneath 1,000,000 tons of rock. And I know that the deep, profound silence of the ponderosa pines is not empty. It is waiting.